Concerned about the growing darkness in the western kingdoms, the necromancer Zail journeys to Westmarch to restore the balance. Amid his quest, he crossed paths with Lady Celine Nasardo, the last heir to an ancient house who seeks a necromancer to help convene with her late husband. But as they summon Lord Nasardo's spirit in the moldering crypts beneath the family estate, Zail and Celine stumble upon something unexpected. A sinister plot to unleash the demon of Straga and his minions on Sanctuary. While Celine and Zail become entangled in a web of alliances and intrigues that embroil both the nobility and Celine's bloodline, Astraga's allies work to prepare a horrific ritual to ensure his coming. The key to his return? The Moon of the Spider. It's the heart of the mounting evil in Westmarch. Who wields the malevolent artifact? And to what end? Zail sat warily across from the wolf creature, trying to decipher its thinking. The necromancer and the beast had not moved since first the latter had unexpectedly reached out, not to tear the man apart, but to plead for his aid. The practical side of Zail, generally the far more dominant side, insisted that he leave the Night Howler to its fate. After all, it was a cursed monster, a creature who craved human flesh. It had become a thing of the primevals, nothing more. It was beyond redemption. But the side with which the Rothmanian was less familiar, an emotional side only recently stirred from a long slumber, pointed out that this beast was not acting at all as it should. It reminded Zail more of the ancient legends of the creature, when monsters and their cousins had been regular people, living in the forests and mountains. And so, after staring for more than an hour at his former pursuer, the necromancer rose to his feet and strode toward the injured giant. Meaty hands that could have torn him to bloody goblets of flesh stayed lowered as he came within reach. Zail bent down and touched one of those hands, which then cautiously turned palm up. The Rothmanian murmured under his breath. In response, the Night Howler grunted several times. Zail could not understand what the beast sought to say, but the tone seemed one offering peace and trust. In darkness, there is light. Even as in light, there is darkness. So Rathma preached. Zail hoped that his ancient lord had been correct in that assumption. He turned to the Night Howler's leg, the cause of the creature's distress. Sure enough, it was broken from the force of the explosion. Only the brute strength of the beast had enabled to even rise at first. But that was not enough to explain the change in the fur giant's persona. Somehow, the forces that Zail had summoned had struck deep at the core of the creature's heart and soul, retching from them the vile taint of the primevals. It was the only explanation that made sense. The necromancer started to reach for the shattered leg, then took one last look into the beast's eyes. His brow arched. Even in the dark, you could see the astonishing transformation in them. Gone were the blood, redness, and insane fury. Here now was a pair of orbs, so very touching in their nearly human grief. Those eyes decided it for him. The Rothmanian touched his dagger to the area in question while his free hand drew symbols just above the leg. The Night Howler let out a grunt. Its paw slid near the leg. Zail glanced toward the huge hand, but did not falter. All that mattered was his spell. The beast withdrew its paw, leaving the necromancer to his task. A faint moonlight glow spread across the ruined limb. As it did, the leg strained, and the tears in the skin sealed themselves. The scars tightened, then completely faded. Even the fur returned. When he was done, Zail let out a long gasp. It had not taken him much time, but the effort had been monumental. Still, the results pleased him. There was a loud grunt in his ear. The cloaked figure suddenly lifted bodily into the air. Twice the giant touched his moist black nose against Zael's. That done, the night howler grunted in a longer, more elaborate fashion before setting its much smaller companion on the ground. "You are welcome," Zael said, not knowing how else to respond. The giant figure grunted, seemingly better at understanding the human than the human did it. He expected the monster to rush off into the forest, but the giant instead let out another series of growls, all the while gesturing behind Zael. The necromancer at first thought that perhaps another threat lurked in that direction, but gradually came to understand that the giant was pointing towards West March. Yes, I must go there. The rain had let up, some anyway, and although even Zael's training could not entirely keep his exhaustion and pain at bay, he had to continue on. However, as he started off, the night howler fell in line behind him. The Wrathmanian peered back. "There is no need for you to come with me." The beast's response was another series of growls and grunts, some quite elegant despite being unintelligible. Their meaning was clear. The creature would not leave Zael to fend for himself. "You owe me nothing. You may return to the forest." His giant companion appeared undaunted. Zael frowned. Then, resigning himself to the inevitable, he turned from the night howler and continued his trek. Behind him came the almost silent padding of thick feet. Compared with the creature's footsteps, his own resounded like thunder. It took all of Zael's reserves to make the journey, but with the night howler at his heels, the necromancer felt his confidence return. When at last he sighted the distant walls of the city, he exhaled deeply, not at all concerned at the moment about the fact that the inhabitants likely wanted his head as much as the demons of Ure had. Tragao be praised. Zael looked over his shoulder for his furred companion. But without warning, the night howler had disappeared. The necromancer cautiously surveyed the dark forest. There was no sign that the legendary beast had even been with him. Zael marveled at both the creature's cunning and its ability to move in silence. He had been fortunate indeed to have escaped its initial attack. With the capital in view, the beast had rightly assumed that any obligation it had to him had ended now. Zael made the sign of the balance, and wished the forest dweller a safe return to its den. The Wrathmanian had made of this creature an outcast among its own kind, for they were still tainted by the power of the prime evils. Zael had not given his former adversary any true blessing. The lone night howler would ever have to be at odds with the others. Yet the beast had been grateful to be rid of the evil within, and the necromancer now reassured himself that, under the same circumstances, he would have felt the same. A slight lightening of the heavens was the only sign of the shift from day to night. The weather continued its foul course, driven, the necromancer sensed, by those powers gathering in and around the city. Powers possibly manipulated by the Lord Jinn, and then staring at West March, the name Caribitis suddenly came to mind. Only, this time, Zael remembered, and gaped in horror at the knowledge once again flowing free through his mind. Celine pushed herself uncertainly to her feet. She had fallen a tremendous distance. far deeper than the third level to which she had assumed she was descending. By her own reckoning, which at this point she knew was questionable, the noblewoman had dropped the equivalent of 3 or 4 additional levels. Had it not been for her unpredictable abilities, Celine was certain that she would have perished. The rocks upon which she now lay were jagged, sharp. That she had only a few bruises was a miracle in itself. Stone and rubble lay scattered in every direction. The blue glow still floated near her, but its scope was limited. And so, her first glimpse of her surroundings beyond the area of the fall revealed little. Peering around, Celine saw no sign of Polth. Despite what had happened, she felt certain that there had been no treachery intended on his part. His shade had expected that the same reflexes that had saved her from the creatures in the crypt would protect her now. Celine wished that she had such confidence in herself. She stumbled forward, the glow accompanying her. For the first time, Celine became frustrated by its meager illumination. If it had been brighter, perhaps she would have seen the area upon which she had been treading had been unstable. Certainly that would have saved her much trouble. Eyes fixing on the magical light, Celine concentrated. She wanted more. She wanted a light capable of illuminating whatever lay ahead so that she would not fall prey again. The glow obliged, swelling several times its previous size and radiating a light so bright that at first the Lady Nisardo had to shield her gaze in order to avoid being blinded. And when she dared look again, the sight before her caused the noblewoman to stumble back in shock. The small passage in which she stood ended only 2 yards ahead. Had she taken a single step more, Celine would have discovered that fact without the amplification of her light spell. But even then, she would not have beheld as much as a tenth of what lay beyond. The chamber stretched downward and around, forming a vast bowl. More amazing, filling that bowl was a huge amphitheater of stone benches in which hundreds could have sat without any crowding whatsoever. Despite its obvious age, the overall structure was all but intact. Other than dust, the only signs of the onslaught of time were cracks here and there in the benches, and one section where the roof above had collapsed, crushing 2 rows to her right. Yet, as astonishing a sight as it was, it paled against that which Celine made out at the far end of the ancient structure. The spider hung from a web of gold that covered the cavern wall. Its humongous body was composed of a black jade that glittered evilly in the glow. Each segmented leg was arched downward and ended in ruby talons. The head was at least as large as Celine herself, and upon it was clustered 8 sets of 8 huge diamonds. The noblewoman averted her own eyes from the crystalline orbs, for there was something in their facets that made it seem that the spider stared back at her with great hunger. Finishing the image were a pair of golden fangs, tipped with more crimson rubies. Vivid memories of the creatures in the crypt arose. Celine quickly looked around, and although there was no sign of any of the horrors, she wanted nothing more than to return to her home. Better to face the good Captain Mathis than remain here any longer. Yet, instead of doing just that, the Lady Nisardo took a step down toward the amphitheater. She could not explain her actions even to herself. Her mind screamed for her to turn and run, but somehow the huge arachnid drew her closer despite her disgust and fear of it. Her foot touched the first stone. A whispering issued forth from all around Celine, but she saw no trace of its source. The noblewoman took another step, and the whispers grew a shade louder. There was a rhythm to them, almost like singing or chanting. Drawn by the spider as if caught in its silk, Celine continued to descend. The chanting intensified, seeming to her to resound throughout the amphitheater. She now saw, or was she imagining, robed figures of men and women seated upon the benches ahead of her. Their expressions, ones of rapture. Their eyes staring unblinking at the overwhelming arachnid. The ghostly throng beat their hands together in sync with their chanting. Midway down, what they said finally became clear. It was not a phrase. At first, Celine's subconscious had registered it, but rather, it was one word. A name.
Estraga.
They chanted.
Estraga. Estraga. Estraga.
She whispered with them. There was something so familiar about the name, as if she had known it well as her own, then had, for some inexplicable reason, forgotten it.
Estraga.
The specters continue, seeming to urge her on.
Estraga.
Celine neared the bottom, the gargantuan spider god now almost hovering over her. Ahead lay an altar, faded crimson streaks lining the surface like veins. Suddenly, on the altar lay the shade of a young woman with wide, drugged eyes. Behind her stood an emaciated priest upon whose robe was a silhouette of the spider god.
Estraga. Estraga.
He called.
We offer our gift to open the way for your coming.
From his voluminous garments he drew a wicked blade. The crowd's chanting reached a crescendo. A cry filled the amphitheater. Half caught between the past and the present, Celine de Sardo turned at the sound. Men in armor, men as ghostly as the robed figures upon whom they fell, poured into the gathering. Swords slashed and arrows down those who stood to block the newcomer's path. No quarter was given.
The sons of Arrakis are upon us,
Came the frantic shout.
The sons of Arrakis are upon us. Finish the ceremony.
This from the direction of the priest. As Celine glanced there, she saw that there were now two others, a woman and a portly man. It was the latter speaking.
Finish the ceremony before their damn Viziera show up.
But the figure with the knife shook his head.
No! The moon is already slipping past. The moment is lost.
He ended something to the woman that Celine could not make out. Something round.
Take it! It must be passed on until his time comes again. But where? Anywhere. To the far edge of the world if need be.
Growled the dagger wielder. The amphitheater warriors who had died centuries past put again to death those whose bones were also long dust.
So long as those who come after us remember when it must be returned. And where? But what about the blood?
The other man insisted, pointing at the young woman chained before them.
Where do we find another of her blood? That is key is the timing and the moon.
The lead priest smiled grimly.
Ruckus himself, in his eagerness to create a dynasty, has provided us with the potential for many.
He too indicated the drugged woman.
As with her, there will be those with the proper blood. Now go! Hurry! I sense the Vajra even now!
The woman nodded. With her burden and the portly figure beside her, she turned and faded into history. A monstrous expression smearing his face, the dagger wielder loomed over his intended victim. The moment might have passed for the young woman's sacrifice to be of use to his god. But that would not stop the priest from slaying her for his own desires. The bolt that suddenly blossomed in his throat, however, did. The dagger fell. The priest let out a groan and toppled over the girl, who finally stirred. She let out a moan, then her eyes, focusing for the first time, looked directly at Celine. With the Lady Nasardo's own eyes. The amphitheater went still. With a groan, Celine fell to one knee. The cries of the dying faded from her ears. It took the noble woman more than a minute to readjust to her surroundings. Slowly, she rose and looked about. The entire edifice was as she had first seen it. Dust, cracked benches, and little more. The bodies of the slaughtered cultists did not litter the walkways. Nor were there any more armored men charging in through what Celine now saw was a rebel-filled passage. All of that was in the far past, where it belonged. Her gaze returned to the altar. The woman with Celine's eyes was no longer there, as much a lost memory as all the rest. Still shaken, Celine nonetheless summoned the courage to touch one of the faded red streaks. She knew it now for the dried blood of the previous sacrifices.
Horrible.
Celine muttered.
Sometimes, some horror is necessary for the ultimate good.
She spun about and found herself facing a cowled and armored figure. His black garments and pale, somewhat gaunt face reminded her a bit of Zail.
You see the dead nearly as well as we.
The shrouded man commented clinically.
Perhaps because of what you carry within. In some ways, you see them even better.
Who are you? You look like...
Celine hesitated to go any further.
Like Zail.
He gave her the ghost of a smile.
That is, because I am as he is, a follower of blessed Brahma, a necromancer, if you will.
The black-clad figure bowed slightly.
They call me Caribitis.
Celine went pale. She spun away from Caribitis and all but ran face first into a monstrous shape dangling from the giant, jeweled arachnid. A spider, a living spider as large as an infant. This spat in her direction, its savage mandibles working as if the creature was tempted to take a bite of her face. Coarse black fur covered its hideous bulbous body. 8 malevolent green orbs clustered together just above the mandibles, all of them fixed upon the stunned noblewoman. Celine backed away and collided with the armored form of the necromancer. Carybitis seized her wrists, keeping her pressed against his body. With his short, cropped gray hair and scholarly face, he reminded her of some of the instructors who had tutored her in her youth. That made his every word, so casually spoken, all the more horrific.
Now, my lady Nasardo, you mustn't be afraid of my little one here. Scarro does only what I ask of him, and he knows that you must not come to harm. Yet.
Let me go!
Truly, as Rathma says, the balance will guide you if you are patient. I come here to retrieve a small but significant item for our task. A dagger. And I find you waiting as if eager to already be upon the altar stone.
Gritting her teeth, Celine tried to summon up her power. If there was ever a time it was needed, it was now. The glow she had created became a blinding sunburst. Grunting, Carybitis used one hand to shield his gaze. Celine tore out of his weakened grip, racing in the only direction presently open to her. That it took her farther from the entrance through which she had fallen did not matter. All that did was that she get as far away from the necromancer as she could. Behind her, Carybitis muttered something. The earth beneath her feet rumbled. Celine let out an exclamation as fissures cracked open all around her. Bones, ancient bones, flew up out of the fissures. There were femurs and skulls, ribs and shoulder blades. Whole pieces and fragments swirled around her as if she were caught in a tornado. She tried to break through, but the whirling mass moved with her. Celine would slap something away only to have it flow right back to her. Then, several pieces dropped to the ground. Atop them fell others, the bones quickly stacking up and creating square formations. A wall of human remains arose in front of the noblewoman. Celine turned, but the same thing happened. She glanced behind her and saw that she was also barred there. A cage of bone now stretched well above her. The last few pieces created a top, ensuring that Celine would not even be able to climb to freedom. She slammed her fist against the cage, and although a flash of blue energy accented her strike, nothing happened. Save that Celine's hands suddenly began to throb with pain. Calm, measured footsteps warned her of Carybitis' approach. The Lady Nasardo turned to face him. Her captor seemed not the least irritated by her escape attempt. If anything, he appeared very satisfied.
The blood does flow true in you. I sensed it from the first. It will open the way.
What are you talking about? Why are you doing this?
He shushed her, as one might a rapacious child.
Please be aware that I do this all for the good of the balance, and therefore the good of the world.
From over his cloaked shoulder, the monstrous arachnid appeared. The repulsive creature crawled along Carybitis' arm, nestling in the nook. Carybitis gazed down at the spider, his expression finally showing emotion. He murmured to the beast as if it were a baby, scratching its back at the same time. When his attention returned to Celine, the emotion vanished.
I must beg your forgiveness for what I'm about to do. It is a variation of what we call the life tap. It is necessary so that you attempt no further foolishness.
Before their imprisoned woman could react, his free hand darted through a gap in the bone prison. The gloved fingers touched her just above the breastbone. An incredible weakness coursed through Celine. She felt as if every bit of strength drained away from her, and into the necromancer. The noblewoman pulled from him, but it was already too late. She felt her consciousness slip away, and as Celine Nasardo collapsed, she heard Caribitis, not the least inflection in his voice, say,
I am so sorry. Really, I am.